Hello, I'm Dr. Win Cordovan for KPOL and Kontaktmission with a brief description of the case for an original monotheism. The question I'd like to address occupied many scholars in the 19th and early 20th centuries, but is not brought up all that often anymore. How did religion originate? Or to put it in a slightly different way, what did the religion of the first human beings look like? Whether the universe had existed for about 14 billion years or for a mere 5 days or so before human beings showed up is not directly relevant to this question, though it is, of course, an important issue in its own right. For our purposes here, it is sufficient to recognize that in either case there must have been a person somewhere in the past who first carried the genotype which we identify as that of Homo sapiens, and the spouse must have been sufficiently genetically close so that the offspring would also be recognizably Homo sapiens. There must have been an original pair of human beings, an Adam and Eve. Now, for the Bible-believing Christian, the answer is easy, perhaps even trivial. God created Adam and Eve and kept fellowship with them. You can't separate creation and religion. The first human beings knew of God and worshipped Him. Unfortunately, even though I said above that the question is not usually dealt with directly any longer, it is fair to say that many contemporary scholars are pretty much united in believing that, whatever the answer might be, we cannot accept that religion began with such a lofty idea as there being only one God whom people worshipped. Rather, they argue, when human beings were on a low level of material culture, their religion, if it deserves to be called that at all, consists of manipulating magical forces and venerating the ancestor and natural spirits that they believe were present all around them. Then slowly the spirits were elevated to the level of gods, and eventually one god distinguished himself as more prominent, a rise in status that led the most advanced people to conclude that this paramount deity had really been the one true God all along. If this kind of description were true, what we read in the Bible would have to be false, a myth concocted by writers in antiquity in order to promote their beliefs in a naive monotheism. Before going into greater detail, we should remark that there is nothing particularly sophisticated or intellectually demanding required for believing in one creator God. Some opponents to an original monotheism have said that it is inconceivable that so-called traditional people who cannot even count past 10 should have a concept so elevated and refined as belief in a single God. To that, I would reply that, first of all, if you believe in monotheism, you don't need to be able to count past 10. Counting to 1 would be sufficient. Furthermore, it does not take a lot of metaphysical sophistication to arrive at the belief of one creator. Even small children, when looking at the beautiful world around them, are likely to ask, who made this? In fact, it is precisely people whose minds have not yet been filled with various hurdles and distractions who are most likely to ask the question and come to the right conclusion. One method of finding an answer to a question of the first human religion is to look at the materially least advanced people groups around the world on the assumption that their spiritual culture has not changed dramatically over time to learn what their religion is like. Many scholars, such as E.B. Tyler, came to the topic with preconceptions, most specifically that religions which centered around nature spirits and ancestor ghosts were the original starting point, and sure enough, you could find many tribal cultures that practiced such animism. However, there are also data to the contrary. Some people of the so-called least developed cultures believe that there is a God who created the world and gave the people some specific rules to live by. A scholar named Andrew Lang compiled some of these reports and came to the conclusion that there are many tribes that are animistic and many that are actually theistic, but he could not say which one was older than the other. It is by sequencing the cultures in question that the celebrated advocate of original monotheism, Wilhelm Schmidt, made his contributions. He applied what is called the culture historical method. Obviously, it is impossible for us to go back in time and see what Neolithic people believed. However, we can trace layers of cultural artifacts. To go with a simple illustration, let's say that someone with muddy boots walks into a house and leaves his prints on the floor. A short while later, someone else with different soles on his boots enters as well and leaves some of his boot prints on top of the others. By looking at the legends of muddy prints in the house, it will be obvious who came in earlier and who came in later. Now, clearly, different cultural layers are more complex to untangle than muddy boot prints, but it is the same process, namely to identify whose cultural footprints are later than others by seeing which ones are on top of each other, so to speak. Schmidt studied the cultures of people all over the globe and with his method established what he called culture circles, the oldest of which included certain tribes in Australia and Africa. As a result of this investigation, the important answer to our guiding question becomes clear. The cultures that presumably are the most similar to those of the earliest humans are those that recognize and worship one God and do not practice very much magic or animism. Let me go out on a limb and state this. When Schmidt's work came out, it was so convincing that non-Christian scholars, with their anti-supernatural presuppositions, simply declared a moratorium on asking the question on the origin of religion. When we read in the Bible that God stands at the beginning of human history, we can know that we believe as Christians has been supported on scientific grounds by Schmidt and other anthropological scholars. Again, I am Dr. Wynne Cordovan for KPOL and Contact Mission, and this was a brief case for original monotheism.